This afternoon, we will have the opportunity to meet and hear Rabbi Arik Ascherman, co-founder of Rabbis for Human Rights. Rabbi Ascherman's talk will be the first Branigin lecture that the Institute for Advanced Study has sponsored since April of 2013. And I am very pleased that today's lecture will focus on an issue of great importance for all of us on every continent of this world that we share. The Institute for Advanced Study, for those of you who may never have heard of it, has been Indiana University's leading center for the pursuit of new knowledge and new directions in all fields of study. It fosters intellectual exchanges that are primarily collaborative and interdisciplinary. As of last academic year, it is working especially hard to support the research of associate professors at Indiana University Bloomington. If you wish to learn more about the Institute, please visit our website, ias.indiana.edu. It is thanks to an endowment from the estate of IUB alumna Jean Lois Porteous Branigin that the Institute is able to sponsor the Branigin Lecture Series, bringing to the Bloomington campus distinguished interdisciplinary scholars, artists, and public figures from all fields whose work contributes to the scholarly and creative vitality of the university community. Many supporters, individuals and units on campus, joined together to make Rabbi Ascherman's visit possible. But I want to thank in particular three co-sponsors. The Collins Living Learning Center, I believe it was the students who first had this idea, the Robert A. and Sandra S. Bourne's Jewish Studies program, and the Department of Religious Studies. Now I'm going to pass the microphone, so to speak, or at least cede the floor to Professor Larry Moss, who initiated the nomination of Rabbi Ascherman as a Branigin lecturer of the Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you. Larry.
I wanted to start by thanking Eileen and Yvonne Hedden, her former associate director, for all their very generous help in bringing Rabbi Ascherman here. In thinking about this lecture, the first thing I did was to write to Uri Avneri, perhaps the longest standing peace activist in Israel, for impressions. And he wrote back two sentences that I wanted to quote directly for you. Dear Larry, with pleasure, Arik Ascherman fulfills an indispensable mission as an organizer of actions for peace. This is especially important because the great mass of Jewish religious organization in Israel are identified with the occupation, the settlements, and everything that is wrong in Israel. All the best, Uri. I think some of the issues that he raises are kind of at center stage in this lecture. And I think the issue of religion and politics on a world scale is of very high academic importance in the humanities. Issues of human rights, of law, of history, politics, sociology, cognitive science, all of these things are impacted by the topics in today's lecture. But in addition, I'm reminded of a Jewish saying, Lo hamidrash ha'ikar ela ha'ma'aseh, that action is more important than academics, to some extent. Action is more important than academics, that this is the main thing. And his whole life is actually is a huge testament to this phrase. He's several times been on trial for civil disobedience in Israel. In his organization that he founded, the Rabbis for Human Rights. He is the winner of numerous prizes. Let me quote a few of them. The Abraham Joshua Heschel Award of the Jewish Peace Fellowship, the Humanitarian Achievement Prize of the Holistic Peace Institute, the Keter Shem Tov Prize, the Yeshayahu Leibovitz Prize, the Speaker of the Knesset Prize for contributions to Israel, the Nuanu Peace Prize, and the Gandhi Peace Prize, to name just a few. I think in addition to specifically Jewish activism, I think a case could be made that his work on human rights goes beyond merely the Jewish tradition. It also embodies in the Islamic tradition what we would call ta'aruf, of recognizing the other. And the Jewish activism on behalf of Palestinian olive growers, for example, very well-known activism that he's engaged in, are among what I would consider to be the high points of Jewish life today. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Rabbi Arik Ascherman.
Thank you. I guess I have to turn this back on somehow. Is there a button? Okay. Is that working? Yes. All right. The other one's on? I don't know if I've ever had two microphones at once. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be here and an honor to be able to give the Branigin lecture. Maybe I'll start by saying that a few years ago, I was invited by the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and one of the local Oslo peace organizations to a conference that brought together religious people from several conflict areas around the world. The premise of the conference was very interesting. The standard wisdom for many, many years in the diplomatic community has been that if you want to solve a difficult conflict, keep religion out of it. The idea being that religion is so illogical, so intractable, that the only way to solve difficult conflicts is to bypass religion wherever possible. But the diplomatic community was starting to come to the realization that that doesn't always work. There are some parts of the world, and ours is one of them, where religion is such a powerful factor that you cannot expect to bypass it. So if you can't beat them, you better join them, or something like this. But in fact, in our part of the world, religion is not simply something that you do. You go to synagogue or church or mosque or temple or whatever once a week. It really is, for many, many, the motivating and driving factor, what determines what they do just about every minute from the moment they get up in the morning until they go to sleep at night. And in that kind of context, it therefore becomes a little bit more essential to try to think about, with all of the potential drawbacks and difficulties that bringing religion into the mix entails. And believe me, there are also some days that I get up and say, well, maybe John Lennon had it right, but given that religion isn't going to disappear, we really need to think about, is there any way that religion can play a positive role in a place like the Middle East, even though, if we're honest about it, if you look at history, so much blood has been shed in the name of religion and nationalism. Maybe the other kind of introductory remark I will make is that when I was an undergraduate and working on my honors thesis, surprise, surprise, given who I am, it was on the effect of religion on social activism, the impact. Now, when one looks at how religion maybe impacts on actions, there's a couple different ways of going about it. One can go to typologies such as that of Max Weber and look at how different religions come out on different kinds of being accepting the world versus trying to change the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other is a more difficult to define or categorize, which is how faith interacts in the heart and soul of an individual. And I will, hopefully my remarks will shed some light, perhaps a little bit on both of those. When I think about myself, I certainly think that I'm a product of a religious tradition which does talk about not simply accepting the world as is, but trying to change and improve the world, what we call tikkun olam, something like co-creationism in some Christian circles, being God's partners in the ongoing work of creation almost, but certainly repairing and sanctifying the world. But when I think certainly about what pushes me and drives me personally, and what some people ask me sometimes, how you avoid burnout in kinds of situations when other people do throw up their hands, I think it's also that less easily studyable or categorizable or whatever aspect of religion, the intangible issues of faith. In 2008, we in Israel celebrated our, which anniversary? 60th. A time of great celebration for us as Israelis, a time to give thanks for the fact that after 2,000 years of oppression, in many ways because of the fact that we had been stateless and homeless, we now had an opportunity, so to speak, to exercise our right of return. And again had some control over our own destiny. We know, of course, that what for us as Israelis is a cause for great celebration is for others the Nakba, the great disaster. And I could shorten my usual 5-hour talk by simply saying that when it comes to Palestinians in Israel here, that's only one piece of what we do in Rabbis for Human Rights. Our goal is to bring a little bit closer to fruition that promise that God makes time after time in the first book of the Torah, of the Bible, where God says repeatedly, "Through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." In other words, if today we are in a zero-sum game, what is a blessing for us is a curse for others. We want to get to a win-win situation, and what's a blessing for us is a blessing shared by all. On the occasion of that anniversary, we issued a series of 2 radio ads, each with a piece of the recording of the original recording of our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, reading out as he did in 1948 our Declaration of Independence. And in the first, you hear him say that the country will be mushtetet, the very foundation of its existence will be cherut, tzedek v'shalom, freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. And in the second, you hear him say that the country will guarantee total social and political equality for all, regardless of religion, nationality, or gender. And our ads went on to say, we had this vision, we had this dream 66 years ago. Where have we succeeded? And where have we not yet succeeded? We didn't say where we failed, because 60 or even 66 years is not long time as countries go, but where have we not yet succeeded? Because if we're being honest with ourselves, which believe me, for us in the Jewish community is not easy, so aware of so many people out there in the world that don't have any great love for Israel, it's sometimes hard for us, even when we get together among ourselves, to be honest about what we're really feeling or thinking. But when we are being honest with ourselves, as difficult as that may be, for all the amazing and wonderful things that Israel has accomplished in such a short amount of time, we haven't lived up yet to our own dream. Certainly not in the field of human rights. We aren't doing what we thought we were setting out to do when we created Israel. So now, we are in an event co-sponsored by the Jewish Studies Department and the Religious Studies Department. And so some of you maybe know something about the Bible. Maybe some of you read it once in a while. And if so, you may be asking yourselves, well, what did the prophets have to say about freedom, justice, and peace? Do they all agree with each other? You know, we love to quote the prophet Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares, and we'd rather not think about the prophet Joel, who talked about beating plowshares into swords. And so again, one of the most amazing video clips that I have is from a few years ago. We were out with a television crew from ABC Australia, and we caught two Israelis in the act of stealing olives from Palestinian-owned trees. And out there in the middle of the olive groves, this surreal, bizarre debate develops. I'm wearing a kippah, a Jewish religious head covering, so are they. We're all religious Jews. And so we get into this seemingly esoteric discussion about what the Jewish tradition has to say about the property rights of non-Jews in the biblical land of Israel. Except for it's not so esoteric because, as I said a few minutes ago, in our part of the world, these are really the things that are pushing people and driving them and determining what they're thinking and doing. So let's just say it wasn't the most productive discussion. Nobody was listening to each other all that carefully. This wasn't calm academic discourse as you try to have at the university. And at one point, in a rather mocking way, one of them says to me, well, you must be reading from a warped Torah scroll. And I must admit that I more or less descended to their level when I answered in kind, and when I said, you know, I think you're right. I think I am reading from a different Torah scroll than you are. Mine has things that seem to be missing from yours, like don't steal, don't trespass. The point is that in our part of the world where religion is such a powerful force, on the one hand, if anyone ever says to you, Judaism says, a big red warning light has to go off in your head because our religion is simply too ancient and multi-layered and based on debate to say that about almost anything. But on the other hand, in our part of the world where religion is such a powerful force, we can't therefore even agree what our religion might have to say about some of the most burning moral issues that we face as a society. And therefore, if our first mandate in Rabbis for Human Rights is to try to prevent or reduce human rights, or prevent or reverse human rights abuses, then our second and no less important goal and mandate is to try to introduce into the intellectual universe of our fellow Israelis another way of understanding our own Jewish tradition of Torah very different than the one that's become dominant in Israel today, where for a variety of historical and sociological reasons, Israeli society, particularly in the religious community, is being socialized into a very problematic mixture of where religion is an extreme mixture of nationalism and particularism. Particularism as opposed to universalism, meaning that the wonderful ideas that we have in our Jewish tradition stemming from the very first chapter of the Bible where we're taught that all human beings are created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that therefore, once it was in 1995, I had just started working for Rabbis for Human Rights. This was just, and then just a month after Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, we went for a morning of study at a yeshiva, headed by a rabbi who had been quoted on the radio as saying that bombs should be placed on the side of the road to prevent withdrawals from territory. And he's one of the rabbis suspected, although it was never proven and he denies it, of being one of the rabbis that gave a halachic, a Jewish legal justification or approval for the assassination. And we study with the students in the morning, and then we have a roundtable discussion with this rabbi and his students and some of our rabbis. And he starts with what is, I just quoted, what is so basic to what we believe as rabbis of human rights, where he says, you know, because we believe that every human being is created in God's image, therefore Judaism cannot condone or the oppression or mistreatment or humiliation of any human being. So far, so good. We all agree. And then we get into the details, and then we get into a little bit more trouble. So we're talking about some of the things going on in Hebron at the time. Mistreatment of Palestinians by settlers or soldiers. And he says, well, you've never seen it. You're getting it from third-hand, unreliable sources. Well, we have seen it. And then one of his own students gets up. And he says, Ava kvod Rav. But Rabbi, when I was doing my army service in Hebron, I saw it with my own eyes. So you could have heard a pin drop at that point, and I would like to tell you that the end of the story was they all signed up that day to become members of Rabbis for Human Rights. Didn't quite happen, but that's when they did come to see us again. And again, it's another, what we're trying to do is introduce into the intellectual universe of our fellow Israelis another way of understanding Judaism different than the one that people are learning in most religious institutions. One of our founding rabbis, his daughter, went to Bnei Akiva, one of the Orthodox youth movements, and she met her husband-to-be when there was a vaguely liberal speaker, and they're the only two people that clapped their hands at the end. That's how they met each other. So anyone who's looking, that's a piece of free advice, but it's, again, indicative of that socialization going on in that society. With the way I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, it was simply assumed that a basic part of what it means to be a Jew is to be concerned about universal human rights and social justice. That's what I learned from my parents, from my rabbis, from my community. Consistently, public opinion polls of the American Jewish community show that these are dominant, majority-held values. And so when I first spent time in Israel, and now I'm going to date myself a little bit, explain why there's not so much red left in my beard. My first greatest shock at the time was to find out that bagels were not readily available. What kind of Jewish state is this if you can't get bagels, right? But my more profound shock was to find out that these values, which were so axiomatic that I never would have thought of questioning them, were not necessarily shared by all Israelis, as I said, particularly religious Israelis. Rabbis for Human Rights was founded during the first Intifada, back in December of 1988. I actually was not one of the founders. I came a little bit later. But there was much more sympathy among average Israelis for Palestinians during the first Intifada than, let's say, the second Intifada. There wasn't the same level of violence or terror. And many average Israelis who weren't left-wing or political or activists simply felt that moral red lines had been crossed. Many of our current human rights organizations in Israel were all founded about that time. B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights, Workers' Hotline, and many others are all right now having our 25th anniversaries, although we'd rather be out of business. It's no great celebration to be having your 25th anniversary when you're in our line of work. But there was also a feeling among many rabbis that there needed to be a Jewish rabbinic response to what was happening in our society. And our founder, Rabbi David Foreman, wrote an open letter to the chief rabbinate saying, why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned about Sabbath observance, about kashrut, our Jewish dietary laws? Where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels running around this country and crying gewalt and speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society? Rabbi Heschel, the descendant of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent most of his career writing important books, which I'm sure are part of the Jewish studies here at the university. But he didn't just stay in the ivory tower. He was one of the first people to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He was behind the scenes, and forgive me for any of the Catholics in the audience, and I'm going to butcher the Latin here, but Nostra Aetate, the clauses in Vatican II, which led to rapprochement between the Jewish and Catholic communities in the 1950s. He was very active in the struggle against the Vietnam War, and his picture hangs on our wall marching with Martin Luther King. he in many ways is our role model of a rabbi and a scholar who is also a social activist. And this met a need that many, many rabbis were feeling. And we came together. To this day, we are the only rabbinic organization in Israel explicitly dedicated to human rights, and the only one in which rabbis from different movements within Judaism, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Humanist, all coexist in one organization without strangling each other. So I know that there are no sectarian issues in any other religions, but for us, this is a big deal. Okay. In fact, when we first started, it was so unusual for rabbis to be working together and to be concerned about Palestinians that all we had to do was show up someplace where human rights abuse had taken place and the press would show up, because it was kind of like man bites dog. And although it's not so simple anymore, we have been, as was mentioned, received the Speaker of the Knesset's Prize for our contributions to Israeli society. We've been endorsed in this country by rabbinic bodies of the Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal movements. And I like to say that at home, we are at the human rights table. Again, we certainly haven't succeeded at everything we've tried to do, but we are working every day with government ministers and members of Knesset and the press and the international community and those that are setting policy and shaping public opinion. We work sometimes through the courts, sometimes through the press, sometimes through public and media campaigns, sometimes lobbying our government in the Knesset, sometimes through direct field work. Like in recent months, we've been having our volunteers as human shields, sometimes with Palestinian farmers trying to get to their olive groves. And sometimes, when all else fails, through acts of civil disobedience. I myself have been on trial several times, including for standing in front of bulldozers that had come to demolish Palestinian homes, not for any security reason, but because of a catch-22 situation in which you can be, if you are a Palestinian, you can have clean security record. You can have an uncontested title to your land. You can stand on your head. And in most cases, you will not be able to get a legal building permit because of an intentional manipulation of building and zoning laws to make that almost impossible. There's one set of laws for settlers and another system for Palestinians. And then when you are forced to build without a permit that you couldn't get, your home is illegal and subject to demolition. Now, I said a few minutes ago, or maybe I didn't, but I should have, that in many ways, Israel is a very strong democracy. I'm going to put the 300-pound gorilla of the occupation aside for a second. I'm talking inside Israel. We have racism. We have discrimination. Find me a democracy that doesn't. But in many ways, we have a lively debate. We have many people that agree with many of our opinions, although not enough of them act on them. But in a democracy, you can't just go and do civil disobedience every time you disagree with something, because that would be chaos. But as Rabbi Heschel would say so often, in a democracy, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. So seeing that bulldozer tearing into that home, the father of the household clutching at his heart as he's about to have a heart attack, the women tearing at their hair and pleading with us to do something, and knowing that the worst is yet to come, the moment I would not wish on my worst enemy, and that's the moment the children come home. They went off in the morning and they had a home when they went off to school, and they come back and there's rubble. It's at those moments that I feel that that Torah that I, as a rabbi, am sworn to uphold is being ground into the rubble along with that home. And that image of God that we're all supposed to be recognizing in every human being and honoring is being banished from that place. And it's at those times when it has no choice, really, but to stand in front of the bulldozers. In this case, I was put on trial. There were some amazing moments. Again, recognizing how difficult it is for many Jewish leaders around the world to be open about what their concerns may be, because of the concern that loving concern could be twisted, their words could be twisted by people that don't have Israel's best interests in mind. The fact that we had over 400 rabbis sign an open letter about the home demolition issue was very moving. And then it turned out that the day that I was to take the stand on my own behalf fell between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Of course, one of the holiest times in our Jewish calendar, those 10 days in which we are supposed to answer God's call, make an effort to turn and to change and to return to our truest and highest selves. And as I said to the judge, from the moment that I knew that this would be the day that I would take the stand on my own behalf, what kept on ringing through my head are those words we say just before the famous Kol Nidrei prayer on Yom Kippur, where we say, B'yeshiva shel malu, b'yeshiva shel mata. In the heavenly court above and the earthly court below, we can all pray together on this most holy of eves. And I said to the judge, in a few days, it's going to be Yom Kippur. And because we believe that every single human soul on this planet is being judged on that day, we ask of God in the Yeshiva Shel Mala, in the heavenly court, not to judge us while sitting on the throne of strict justice, but rather to move and sit and judge us while sitting on the throne of mercy and compassion. How can we ask that God in the Yeshiva Shel Mala, if in the Yeshiva Shel Mata, if in the earthly courts and institutions in which we are responsible both for justice and for mercy, if we don't do the same? And I reminded the judge that in the Bible, in the original Hebrew, justice and law are synonyms. Tzedakah u'mishpat. I don't know how many lawyers or legal scholars or pre-law folks we have here in the room, but I think most of us know that unfortunately in our world, that's not always the case. So I actually had the prosecuting attorney in tears that day, but the judge remained rather aloof, and she was the one that counted. Then, though we were convicted and then unconvicted, when the prosecution said we are actually upstanding citizens, it should be expunged for community service. All my friends said I should do community service by rebuilding Palestinian homes, but the judge didn't go for that either. So having not received justice in a court of law, our first act was to leave the courtroom and go and lay a cornerstone to rebuild one of those demolished homes that we've been trying to defend. And for a year after we rebuilt that home, I could have shown you and taken you to visit the family, the Dari family in Issawiyah. Issawiyah in the news today, as it's been one of the most, I left, of course, a Jerusalem in flames, and one of the most difficult neighborhoods, most plagued by conflict right now is Issawiyah. I could have taken you, though, for a year to see that that family was again living in the dignity of having a home, as opposed to being crowded into a relative's home. I could have shown you the housewarming gift that we brought for the family, a grapevine and a fig tree. Of course, in the words of the prophet Micha, that every person should sit under their vine and under their fig tree, that none should make them afraid. That's what we want for every human being. That no Israeli should live in fear of terror. And we've been hearing the news in the recent days of a number of terror attacks, as well as another mosque that was torched today. And that no Palestinian should live in fear of having their home arbitrarily demolished. Unfortunately, that home was demolished again a year later. We helped rebuild it again. But we don't just do this endless cycle of build and demolish and rebuild and demolish. In what may be a Guinness Book of World Records for the longest Israeli High Court case in the making, and the Israeli High Court, unlike the American Supreme Court, takes just about every case, and you can go immediately to the High Court when you are in a need for justice. But in this case, it took us 10 years for a variety of reasons. we knew that we weren't going to stop demolition simply by myself and others standing in front of bulldozers. That we had to get to the heart of the issue, which is this discriminatory planning and zoning. And so on April 28th of this year, the High Court heard our petition to return planning and zoning in Area C for Palestinian communities to Palestinian hands. And by the way, one of the many reasons for delays was that but one of the most recent delays in the last few years was because the Attorney General's office asked for more time because they knew we were right. They wanted more time to try to convince the Army to agree to what we were asking, and unfortunately, they didn't succeed, so we had to go to court. But this is another important cardinal principle of human rights as far as I'm concerned. There was a late 19th century rabbi, Shimon Raphael Hirsch, and he was commenting on the passage that appears twice in the Torah, that when you are harvesting your grains, you are supposed to leave the corners of your fields and the fallen sheaves to be gleaned by the poor. And he says, why does the Torah have to spend so much time going into so many little details? Wouldn't it have just been enough to say those with power and property have to be just and decent to those who don't have? And his answer is the following. He says, you can never allow those with power and property to write the rules. And he says, when, even with the best of intentions, those with power and property take on the white man's burden of how to be just and decent to those who are not sitting at the table, who have no voice. And of course, there are no Palestinians on the planning committees at the moment. It's the army that does the planning. There are no Palestinian judges when you appeal if you get a home demolition order. He says, govel im pesha. It borders on criminality. It's almost always going to end badly. And so a cardinal rule of human rights is that those to be affected must be sitting at the table. They must have a voice. Part of our job is to give a voice to those who don't have it. And to try to do it in a way that is simply not recreating hierarchy ourselves. Because it's so easy when you are part of the dominant group in society, and you have that burned into your hard drive, to act and think like the whites in shining armor who are coming to save the poor natives. And we have to try not to do that as well, but to work with people at eye level as equals, as partners, and in fact, even maybe as junior partners when the people that we're working with are going to live with the consequences in ways that we will not. So on the 28th, on the one hand, sadly, the judges made it pretty clear from the outset that they weren't going to force the government to do what we had our suggested remedy, which was to restore the local and district planning committees that under military rule had been abolished in 1971. But they also said clearly to the state, the current situation is unacceptable. And they gave the state 90 days to come up with a plan to change things. As we suspected, the judges having tipped their hands and saying they weren't going to force the government to accept our remedy, in the end, the state just recently came up with their proposal, which was a fig leaf proposal, that there would be some form of consultation with Palestinians about the planning and zoning, rather than return it to Palestinian hands. And of course, if there's no obligation to listen and to do something with what you hear, then you haven't done anything. It's meaningless, and that is so our job right now is to try to convince the judges to think more about how uncomfortable they were with the current discriminatory situation leading to human tragedy than to the fact that they're uncomfortable with pushing the state too far. On principle, Rabbis for Human Rights is involved with both the human rights of both Jewish Israelis and non-Jews who are part of our society or under control. So we deal with education. We educate about Judaism and human rights. We work with Israeli young people. We believe that economic justice is a human right. If I were to tell you about the depths of poverty and despair among Palestinians, it might not be such a surprise. You may not all know that among Israelis, some 20% of the Israeli elderly are chronically hungry, choosing every day between medicine and food, including Holocaust survivors. Some 25% of Israeli children and youth go to bed hungry at least one night a week. Somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all Israelis are living under the poverty line, and it seems to be rising. Because we're kind of on a lemmings march from what we once had, which was a social welfare economy, to a neoliberal outlook in which the government has no responsibility for the poorest and weakest among us. When I go to the Knesset to talk about these issues, I often make the point that in the Talmud we're taught that a Torah scholar is forbidden to live in a community that doesn't have a list of 10 things, including a system for taking care of each other. We've been dealing over the last 3/4 year with something called the Al-Aluf Committee. A committee was set up to fight poverty in Israel, to figure out how to fight poverty in Israel. Most people didn't pay attention to it because it was neoliberals, ministers appointing neoliberal academics, and it was going to be neoliberal excuses for not being involved. The head of our social justice department, Rabbi Edith Lev, was one of the only person, perhaps one of the few people, that decided we had to pay attention, focus media attention, brought in other organizations. We end up getting decent recommendations. Now the question in the fight right now is, will the government implement them? And where are they going to pay for them, and what have you? One of the issues that keeps me up at night more than anything else is the issue of the Bedouin in the Negev, Israeli citizens. Thank goodness we were able to freeze this year a bill which was going through the Knesset, which would have led to the demolition of tens of Bedouin villages, some 40,000 Israeli citizens being transferred from their homes into townships to become magnets for poverty and despair and drugs and crime, and dispossessing them for most of the remaining land. But we are far from out of the woods. But the good news is that we, as Israelis, as Jewish people, are better than this bill. We did a study which showed that 90% of Israelis subscribe to the idea that the Bedouin are taking over the Negev. And then we said, let's unpack that. What do you mean? So some 70% think that the Bedouin want 25% or more of the Negev. The median being 43.9%. Now for a gold-plated matzo ball, let me ask you a question. In 1920, the pre-state Zionist movement recognized 2.6 million dunam belonging to the Bedouin. But today, if all the outstanding Bedouin land claims were to be honored and recognized, if they were to go to court and win every case, how much of the Negev are we talking about? A little bit more than 2%, but not much more. 5.4%. And your average Israeli Jew said, we're not sure that you're telling us the truth, but if you are, that sounds fair. Have we, as Israelis, sadly, all too many times in our short history been transferers, destroyers, dispossessors? Sadly, the answer is yes. Is it who we are as a people? Is it what we believe in our neshama, in our Jewish souls? No, it isn't. And that's why this bill and this plan, which the government is still trying to now implement without legislation, is not going to go through. When I move across the green line again into the occupied territories, other than the home demolition issue, the other major issue that we've alluded to already is the right of Palestinians to safely access their agricultural land. And the good news, again, is that if in 2002, Palestinians and those of us trying to protect them were being shot at, beaten, threatened, attacked, you name it, and the Israeli security forces were not showing up or coming late or standing by, as a result of our day-to-day work in the olive groves and then engaging the security forces and going to the Israeli High Court, in 2006 we won a victory, the result of which today, by court order, Palestinian farmers are getting to lands they couldn't get to for 2, 5, 10, 15 years. And instead of my volunteers getting their heads literally cracked open, it is now the Israeli army, in many of these cases, that is protecting Palestinian farmers to get to those lands. Just before I left, we had farmers getting to lands they hadn't been to for 14 years, next to the houses of the settlement of Nokdim. And our lawyers have returned many hundreds of dunam, many acres of land to Palestinian farmers when it's been taken over or almost taken over by settlers. But sometimes I meet soldiers and they're angry. They're resentful. Why, as my commander said, my job today is to protect Palestinians? Now, who knows who among them has lost a loved one to a terror attack or an army buddy, and now they're saying, now I have to protect their human rights? That's an emotionally impossible thing to ask of anybody. And you can think of the parallels from the Palestinian side. But that's what you have to do. Just this last week, this last Shabbat, as we were reading in the Torah of the story of Hagar and Ishmael banished into the desert, dying of thirst. And God, according to the Torah, saves them, prepares a well. But according to the Midrash, written by the rabbis almost 2,000 years ago, before God does this, the angels come to God and said, "What are you doing? Don't you know all the suffering the children of Ishmael are going to cause the children of Israel throughout history? Let them die. Just end it all right here." And the Midrash that the rabbis wrote almost 2,000 years ago, God says, it's a form of rabbinic commentary. According to what the rabbis wrote, God says no. God says that no future is inevitable. We are not inevitably and intractably and irreversibly destined to conflict. And God says, Basher Husham, right now in front of me is an innocent child. We too, who are created in God's image, and therefore must be as godlike as humanly possible, we too have to distinguish between the terrorist coming to murder my family, my children, and bombs have gone off not far from my home, and that family that simply wants to put a roof over their heads or harvest their olives. And finally, it all comes down to hope. Since 2000, since the breakout of the Second Intifada, Israelis and Palestinians have been kind of in one big collective depression. The fact is, we don't need another peace plan. We've got plenty of those. We actually need a binational psychiatrist. Poll after poll shows a sane majority of both Israelis and Palestinians who want a compromised, negotiated agreement, but even a larger percentage on both sides that say, we want peace, but they don't. For all the ways you can't talk about symmetry between Israelis and Palestinians when we Israelis have so much more political, economic, and military power. We are incredibly symmetrical in two ways. First of all, we all say, I'm the victim. Speak to any Israeli or Palestinian and say, you're a victimizer, and they will be furious, outraged. How dare you say I'm a victimizer? I'm the victim. Not understanding that you can be a victim and a victimizer at the same time, and sometimes the difference is less than a hairbreadth. And we are parallel that we all say we want peace, but they don't. And then, of course, there's no incentive to move forward. I don't know how many times when I have gone to rebuild a demolished Palestinian home and Palestinian parents have made their children meet with us. And like deja vu, the same conversation time after time. Our 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. He's just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. What do we say to our 10-year-old son when he says, I want to grow up and be a terrorist? And they say to us, we want our son to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes, that there are Israelis who come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Why is it that we correctly get upset when we hear about propaganda being taught in Palestinian schools about Israelis? Because we know that even if we sign the perfect peace treaty tomorrow, if we continue to teach hate about each other, that treaty is not going to last. And in the reality, which everybody, almost everybody understands, the right as well as the left, there is no military solution. We're either going to live together or we're going to die together. And those of us who are sane would rather live together. Then who is really doing more for Israel's long-term security interests? The people that demolish homes and uproot trees and steal olives and steal property and violate human rights? Those who may be pushing us right as we speak here to a third intifada? Or those of us who rebuild the homes and replant the trees and help pick the olives and return the land to its owners and protect human rights? Yes, I think what we're doing is a just and right and Jewish thing to do. But frankly, it is a self-interested thing to do. It is the best thing I can do to protect the lives of my children. And you better believe I'm going to do that. And the real Zionism today is working for an Israel which is not only physically strong, but is morally strong and lives up to our highest Jewish values. One final story. April 15th, 2014, tax day in America. I'm in the village of Bidu, one of 8 villages. Again, Israel's democracy went to Israel's high court against the route of the separation barrier, and they won. Sent the army back to the drawing board, although when the army came back from the drawing board, I don't think the court sufficiently stuck to its own principles. But on this day, I get a phone call. I don't know what we used to do without cell phones. Come quickly to another neighborhood. A 13-year-old boy has been caught by the border police. He's being beaten. I and 2 other Israelis make our way to where the jeeps are. The border police start shooting tear gas at us. The other 2 Israelis go back. I'm the only one stupid enough to keep on going forward. When I get there, the commander beckons me forward, grabs me by the throat, starts shaking me violently, headbutts me, starts screaming, "You're arrested. You understand you're arrested?" I didn't know why I was arrested, but I certainly knew I was arrested. I see this young boy strapped to the windshield of a Jeep, shivering in fear, unsuccessfully trying to hold back the tears. Another man sent by the worried parents is handcuffed in front of a second Jeep. The same was done with me, a third person. And the Palestinian youth, who could have decided not to throw stones at their own, started throwing stones, hitting the Jeeps that were forced to be in front of, and for the next couple hours were used as human shields. And I finished with this story for 2 reasons. First of all, because Israel has such great freedom of the press, this all gets caught on film with people with press cards. Appeared here in Newsweek. It appeared all over the world. And I was inundated with the press afterwards, and we're not shy about working with the press. But at a certain point, I got uneasy. I said to some of these reporters, "You're obsessing on this. It's not like it only could have happened here." 2 weeks after that, the first revelations about the American army in Abu Ghraib came out. Unfortunately, wherever people put on uniform, they all too often think it gives them the permission to violate the very laws they're sworn to uphold. I don't know about you all, but when I was an undergraduate, I had to study at least 10 times, read at least 10 times the Perpendicular prison experiments from Stanford University. You know, you take a group of students, make half of them arbitrarily guards, half of them inmates, and they had to stop the experiment after a day because the people that had been fellow students just the day before, once you give them sunglasses and uniforms, became so sadistic. So as somebody who spends just about every waking hour fighting Israeli injustice, I am very opposed to double standards, to either coddling Israel or unfairly judging Israel more harshly than we would anybody else. And I never forget that Israel is far, far, far from the worst human rights violator in the world. That there are many places in this world that if I were to do a speaking tour like this, I would not be allowed home. And if I was allowed home, my life would be in danger. I'm thankful that I can do what I do in the context of Israel's democracy. But the other reason that I tell that story is because who knows what psychological scars that young boy is going to have for the rest of his life. What he's thinking about all Israelis, maybe all Jews. But when he gave an affidavit to our fellow human rights organization, B'Tselem, after describing all the horrific things that happened to him, he concluded by saying that a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue, told me not to be afraid. The work that we do has its dangers. I've been on many occasions beaten up by Israeli security forces, attacked by settlers, and it's equal opportunity. I've had my car stoned by Palestinians. And the work is not fun. As a rabbi, as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a Zionist, there is no great pleasure in dealing day in and day out with the deepest, darkest corners of the country I love, the country I'm raising a family in, the country I believe in. And it doesn't matter, for that matter, whether it's what we're doing in terms of economic justice to our fellow Israelis or what we're doing to Palestinians. And there are days when I feel like I'm the man who knows too much. I'd be a happier person if I was blissfully ignorant and didn't know the things that I know. But when you know, you have a choice, and it's not just in Israel. I dare say that every person in this room at some point in your lives will have the experience that people that you love very much are doing things you cannot believe that they're doing. Maybe your family, it may be your church or mosque or synagogue, it may be your university, it may be your community, it may be your country, it could, whatever. And when that happens to any one of us, wherever we are, we have a choice. You can stick your head in the sand and say it's not happening. You can go to the opposite extreme and say that terrible, racist, apartheid state, I don't want nothing to do with it. It ain't me, babe. But it is me, babe. It's my people. It's my army. It's our Torah. And so there's a third choice. And that's to take the pain that you're feeling. The pain that you are feeling at things that you would not want to believe possible in the country that you love, and let that pain push you forward to do what we call tikkun olam, again, what some of you in the Christian community would call co-creationism, to be God's partners in trying to create a world, in trying to create an Israel a little bit closer to the one that we believe that God envisions, a little bit closer to the one that we envisioned when we wrote our Declaration of Independence. And that's what we try to do in Rabbis for Human Rights. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? How much time do we have? Okay, we've got plenty of time. And if something I said you didn't agree with or upsets you, Don't go and leave without asking your question. Challenge me. Give me a chance to answer, please. Yes?
Have you had any conversations with Benjamin Netanyahu?
Have I had any conversations with our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu? I've spoken with his aides. I've spoken with other government ministers. I've never spoken with him personally. Yes?
What political party are you a member of?
I am a member of no political party. Rabbis Human Rights, as a human rights organization, is not affiliated with any political party. We have no position on 1 versus 2 versus 10 states or borders here or there. And in fact, we often work with parties on one issue that we would totally disagree with on another issue. For example, one of our other major economic justice victories was defeating the so-called Israeli Wisconsin Plan. Some of you may be familiar with the Wisconsin Plan in this country, a Clinton-era plan in Wisconsin when Tommy Thompson was running for the Republican nomination a couple of times ago. He was very proud of this. This lovely idea that we're going to get people off welfare into the workforce. No one can argue with that, except for it's done through what we call lashon hara, thinking evilly of people. And the assumption was the problem isn't unemployment, but the unemployed. You know, welfare queens driving Cadillacs and what have you. And so we went to Hadera. We set up, to this day, we have a service center in this small, mid-sized town in the middle of the country. And one day, we are going to the Knesset with our women's empowerment group because there's going to be a vote and we think we're in real trouble. And we bring in our people to lobby, and the woman member of Knesset that gets up most passionately to argue against this is Orly Levy. Orly Levy is a member of Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party, a party that I would say is racist, that has very discriminatory attitudes toward Israeli Arabs. And yet, when Orly Levy got up to speak about this plan, she told word for word the story of an Israeli Arab woman from her empowerment group that she'd met just an hour before. If anybody had told me that somebody from Yisrael Beitenu with such passion would recount the personal story of an Israeli Arab woman, I would have said, you're crazy, it can't happen. That's one of the things that tells me you never write anybody off. You work with anybody of any political party per issue. And there are some issues that we'll agree on with some people and disagree with them on the others, and next time it might be the other way around. Yes?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to express my enormous admiration for your work, your courage, and the universality of what you've been saying to us.
Thank you.
Secondly, one phrase you used as you went by was, you said, even as we speak, and referring to current events. How, not just in a strictly political sense, but in the broadest sense, how do you interpret? Is there some kind of change going on right now? I get a sense from the press that the crisis has heightened enormously in the last month, and that something is, we don't know its outcome yet, but that something is up. How do you see this moment?
Okay, that is true, and things have been getting worse and worse since this summer. Of course, we had this terrible war, and I didn't really address that so much, and if people want to know, I can talk more about it afterwards. But certainly one of my feelings was that there was no sane center. Our position basically is that we Israelis have a right to defend ourselves. No country in the world, what would the United States do if one rocket was shot at it, let alone thousands? And yet, our Jewish tradition teaches that even when one is defending oneself, there are red lines. And I strongly suspect that we cross those red lines in a very serious way. I think that although things have kind of become more public in the last month, it was actually about 3/4 of a year ago that there was a very serious policy change. up until about 3/4 of a year ago, not only did Israel's chief rabbis prohibit Jews from going up to what we call the Temple Mount, what Palestinians call Haram HaSharif, Muslims, but every time Jews who wanted to pray up there went to court, the court said, yes, you have a right. By the way, I agree. In the ideal world, Jews should be able to pray on what is a very holy site to us. But they always said, but we're going to leave it to the police to decide whether it's smart or safe or prudent to do it right now when it's such a volatile issue, given the level of distrust and suspicion that exists. 3/4 of a year ago, up till 3/4 of a year ago, the police always said no. And that's changed. So way before it hit the news, there have been groups regularly going up to the Temple Mount, Haram HaSharif. There have been clashes, sometimes a couple times a week. And as to the best of my knowledge, there was no attempt to coordinate this with the Waqf, with any Muslim authorities, but rather just to use our power to make this policy change. It's a reflection of a changing outlook, perhaps. And I think that, in 2009, I expressed the fact that I was very worried that we were on the brink of a third intifada, and that the most likely place for it to start would be East Jerusalem. I think that it didn't happen then because most Palestinians understand that if there's a third intifada, they will be the greatest losers. I think most Palestinians still feel that way, but the balance is changing. Between this summer's war and the radicalization that's taking place on both sides. Today, I don't know how people would vote in Gaza. I'm not sure how many Gazans climbing out of the rubble believe when their leaders say that they won a glorious victory. But in the West Bank today, support for Hamas has skyrocketed, and Hamas would win hands down. In Israel, 30% of Israelis thought we should have used more force. Most Israelis believe we didn't win because we didn't wipe Hamas out. Benjamin Netanyahu, who you asked about before, is the radical left-winger of his own party today. I mean, think about that. And is only tolerated in his party after all the other people that are a little bit more moderate or understand democracy have been purged, because although he isn't particularly popular, when you ask Israelis who's the best suited to be a prime minister, he's still far above anybody else. And so he's the goose that lays the golden egg, and so his own party continues to tolerate him. And in that kind of radicalized situation, where also in the twisted logic of war, because both sides have a huge problem right now explaining to their own people what this was all about and what they got out of it, we had all these soothing messages initially after the war that there were going to be new alliances and there was going to be Egyptian brokered peace or permanent ceasefire. Well, it hasn't happened because neither side, according to the twisted logic of war, wants to make any concessions, even if it could be seen in their benefit, because that would be one further admission of defeat. And so with that atmosphere, with the ongoing building in Jerusalem and elsewhere, I still think that most Palestinians don't want to see a third intifada, but the balance is changing. And there are some who are pushing for it because they very much think that nothing else is going to break the gridlock and the deadlock that we have right now. I should also say, also on that point, that if in Israel today, to this day, there is a debate between Israel's two military intelligence agencies how the second intifada broke out. The Shabak said it was kind of spontaneous, and the Amman said what we've all heard, that Yasser Arafat planned the second intifada when he didn't get what he wanted at Camp David. Now, I think Yasser Arafat made some huge mistakes at Camp David. I can understand why he could have said Barak's generous offer was not so acceptable. I think rather than turning over the table and going home, he would have been better served to acknowledge that nevertheless it was an offer far beyond what any other Israeli prime minister had ever offered, and then listed A, B, C, D, what isn't acceptable to us for further negotiation. But those of us who were in the field were predicting the Second Intifada, sadly, way before Camp David, because a year and a half before it happened, we saw the handwriting on the wall. In the same way that many Israelis were becoming disillusioned with the peace process when the Palestinian Authority was unwilling or unable to stop terror, your average Palestinian was becoming disillusioned with the peace process because human rights violations were going on at a greater pace or equal or greater pace during the Oslo years than before. More settlement building, more land confiscations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this said, Israeli Palestinians, this is not a peace process. Now, maybe if they just held on, they would have got everything back, but that's not the way it looked on the Palestinian street. And so rightly or wrongly, people were open for an intifada. And when we think about the possibility of peace, Palestinians must understand that if sometimes the attitude is you need a little bit of violence to keep Israel interested in a peace process, that in fact that destroys a peace process. And Israelis must understand that you cannot negotiate peace with one hand, no matter how good or bad your offers are, and use the other hand to use your overwhelming power to create facts on the ground and violate human rights, because that too destroys a peace process. And that's kind of the mix that we're in again right now. Yes?
Given what she said earlier, and I very much appreciate the moral stance personally.
I'll repeat the question afterwards. Go ahead.
I very much appreciate the moral stance you're taking and your organization. But given recent events in Gaza and your position that the Israelis or Israel has a right to defend itself, would you also argue that the Palestinians also have a right to defend themselves?
Yes, but when I talk about defending oneself, there's different ways of defending yourself, but the use of violence and power can only be used when you're being directly physically attacked. And, well, okay, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth. Let me go into a little bit more depth into this because I went over it quickly, and this is a hard subject to just gloss over quickly. I often do an exercise, like to do an exercise with Israelis. Every single Israeli school child can quote you from the Talmud when we're taught, if someone's coming to kill you, you get up earlier and you kill them first. We are not a pacifist religion. We have a right and responsibility, as far as the Jewish tradition teaches us, to defend ourselves. But then I ask Israelis how the Talmud continues, and then I get blank stares. So after that, we're taught about the rodef. Someone is chasing after somebody else to murder them, and again, you must murder the kill the pursuer to save the not only save the person being pursued, but to save the pursuer from him or herself. But we're taught, if you could have stopped that person by any other means, if you could have shouted, if you could have shot them in the foot, if you could have started a peace process, and you kill that person, even though you were simply trying to do the right thing, you were trying to save a human life, the Talmud says you're guilty yourself of murder at that point. And then the stakes get even higher, maybe higher than almost any human being could be expected to abide by. We're taught about a man who comes to Rabbah, one of the Talmudic rabbis, and the question is, the strong man in my village is going to go kill me if I don't go kill this innocent third person. What should I do? Rabbah would have had no problem had the question been, can I defend myself against the person coming to murder me? But regarding the innocent third person, he says, let yourself be killed rather than kill. Who is to say that your blood is redder than his? Can we live by that kind of standard? Once, supposedly in the Israeli army, we had a value called Torah Neshek, purity of arms. And there are many true stories of Israeli soldiers who were killed rather than harm civilians. But we're in a different space today. Our founder, Rabbi David Foreman, was a soldier in the First Lebanon War. And he tells the story that he told the story that one day his commander said, look over there, there are Palestinians pointing RPGs at us, but they have civilians in front of them, we're not going to shoot. They didn't shoot, and two of his army buddies were killed. To the day he died, he said, I don't know if I did the right thing or not. How could I have shot and killed innocent people? But how can I look at the widows in their eyes and say, your husband's dead because we didn't shoot? Obviously, when those are your choices, you're already in a lose-lose situation. So from this, I derived 3 tests for any use of military force. Or 1, assuming that you have a legitimate goal, will your intended actions achieve that goal? So for example, we've now renewed not only the administrative demolitions that I've talked about, but we are having again a renewal of punitive demolitions, where the homes of terrorists or suspected terrorists are being demolished. Well, in 2005, the Israeli army stopped that policy because they had figured out that they were actually creating more hatred and more terror by demolishing those homes than they were stopping. So even if the goal of trying to deter people from committing terrorist acts is a legitimate one, they were in fact doing the opposite. Second test is minimum necessary use of force. Again, assuming that you have a legitimate goal, could you have achieved, and that you can achieve the goal through your intended action, could you achieve the same goal by using less force, causing less harm, less destruction? And thirdly, are you harming civilians? So we in the Israeli human rights community have a very simple formula. Civilians, non-combatants must not be targets. Not Israelis and not Palestinians. So when you ask about the Palestinian right of resistance, first of all, although another piece that I wrote this summer was called When Justice Blinds. We all have a form of spiritual myopia because we are so convinced that justice is on our side that we are blinded to God's image in other human beings. We Israelis say we were being shot at. The tunnels were built to murder Israelis. And therefore, there are no red lines. Palestinians say, we've been under occupation for over 40 years. We are suffering from a terrible blockade. And therefore, we have a right to fire rockets at civilians or come out of the tunnels and murder civilians. So first of all, if Gazans were defending themselves against people directly attacking them, that could be considered legitimate right of resistance. Under no circumstances can I justify intentionally, as Hamas tried to do, targeting civilians, non-combatants. Regarding the Israeli reaction, for 3 days, Israel put its forces on the Gazan border and said, Hamas, you must stop these rockets or we're going to attack. There is a quantitative difference. Although I am totally opposed to occupation, and we have called for many years for the end of the blockade of Gaza, there is nevertheless a quantitative difference between those acts, as wrong as they are, and when rockets are directly endangering your citizens. And at that point, and so there's a difference. At that point, you have a right to use a military response. However, in the response that we chose, unless there's something that I really don't understand, and that's why we're calling for investigations, because we don't know everything, we cross those red lines in a very serious way. And I'll give you two examples. Bombing residential homes. The Abu Jama family. The Abu Jama family, there were some 50 people in the home having dinner. Bombs were dropped on that home. 26 people died, 25 people from the family, 19 children. The 26th person was a Hamas operative. Now, if that Hamas operative had been in the act of shooting or about to shoot, then there would have been a little bit more of a dilemma. But as far as we know, all he was doing there was having dinner. Now, maybe there's something I don't know. Maybe that bomb wasn't intended for that house, or I don't know what. But if, as it appears, that house was intentionally bombed because of that one Hamas operative, and in the process we killed 26 people, 19 children, that violates that third principle of the regard for innocent life. The so-called Hannibal procedure. An Israeli officer, Hadar Golden, is dragged into a tunnel by Hamas operatives, apparently already dead. Another officer goes to look for him, comes back, and then we initiate the Hannibal procedure. Because we do not want an Israeli soldier, dead or alive, to fall into Hamas hands and have another round of difficult negotiations like Gilad Shalit, 1,000 people for one. We are going to make sure that they do not get him dead or alive. We intensively bombed that entire area. If he was alive, that bombing killed him as well. 130 people, Palestinians, died. I totally understand why we don't want a soldier or even the body of a soldier to fall into Hamas hands. But to say that in the name of that one can carry out this bombing which killed 130 people is wrong. Now, one more point, and then I'll get back to you. I'll let you continue here. But the other thing is, it is all where the clock starts ticking. If the clock starts ticking when you're being shot at, and the question is how do you respond and how do you take Palestinian lives into account, innocent lives, then you're already getting a lose-lose situation. But what happens if we start the clock back earlier? If we hadn't allowed the peace process to fall apart? If we hadn't done the crackdown on Hamas activists in the West Bank? If in June, not only did we not end the blockade, but we harshened it. If up to that point, and we're talking about exports. If you talk about imports, well, is it dangerous materials? Exports. We were banning to Israel and the occupied territories, but we were allowing to the rest of the world. We stopped that. And so I asked myself, were there Israeli actions that we could have taken or not taken that could have avoided us from getting to that point? But yes, and now you can continue to debate me, but yeah.
There's no debate, and there are other questions
Oh, yeah.
to be asked. I just want to simply say there's another narrative.
Right.
A narrative based on observations by independent sources that challenge the three assumptions that you have laid forth to justify Israel's right to defend itself. And this isn't the moment to get into the nitpicky, but there is another story.
Well, again, I invite you to give at least a hint of that story. If we're talking about occupation and blockade and all the oppression of Palestinians, Those are things I oppose, but I don't think they justify either the tunnels or the rockets. Okay. Yes?
I think what I'm not hearing from you, what I am hearing from you, I have to say, how much I'm in awe of your guts. You come up against the basic law of history.
All of,
The basic law of Israel,
yes.
which many people in this country really have no clue about, but which I take to be what Israel has instead of constitution. And you're banging up against the basic law a lot, and somehow getting away with it. But at the same time, just a few days ago, it seems to me the Minister of Housing, I think it was saying, well, the Al-Aqsa Mosque will eventually have to go away. And so that the temple that can be rebuilt. People are fairly not marginal politicians, but major cabinet ministers and so forth are talking about in these terms, maybe having a debate about whether it should be cooperatively dismantled piece by archivists who carefully handle each fragment and maybe transport it to Mecca or someplace else so that there will be room.
Okay,
Or
so,
if it can't be done cooperatively,
all right. So,
and
so you want me to comment on those kinds of attitudes?
the temple can be built.
So we
Things are background.
yes.
Makes me fear going on the TV every day. I'll see a cloud of smoke.
We have incredibly growing fanaticism and people that have lost all sense of limits. We have increasingly a flaw in our democracy that people say, well, if a majority decided it's democratic, and we've lost the idea that democracy is also about what the majority cannot do. And there are some of the most fanatic people who think that we must do something provocative like tear down Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock to provoke a worldwide jihad against us so that we will force God's hand. God will have to come and save us. Yes, there are some dangerous ideas out there, and you are right that they have a little bit more, they're getting a bit more mainstream than they were in the past. Yes, you had a question here. Yeah, yes, yes.
I liked what you had to say about religion and meanings of the brain in which people just decide how to act, in which people can have a conversation about the content. And I think when you were talking just now about red lines and about when something constitutes self-defense and when it constitutes an attack and when we have the right to self-defense, that's an excellent example of how religion can help us think through what our alternatives are and what the moral response logic. And the question is something like, I really like what you're doing, I really like how you're thinking through a Jewish perspective. How much of a conversation is possible between secular Jews and religious Jews? To what degree is there an overlap between how you're thinking rather than what you're saying and how they're thinking? What kind of conversation is possible?
Well, although there is a very strong anti-religious sentiment among a substantial portion of Israel's population, there's also a very large middle ground of what we're called Masorti, people that think it is traditional, if not exactly religious. I remember once we were doing an educational program in a school, and we were doing it with another organization, and the facilitators were very opposed that we were going to kind of bring in Talmudic material and use a Talmudic style of learning, what we call chavruta, in pairs and this kind of stuff. The kids loved it because it was an affirmation of something that they had of their traditional roots and this kind of stuff. And so that I think that, and I often find that there are many, even our secular activists, who want some kind of affirmation that the things that they believe in have some roots in the Jewish tradition. Yes, there are those who want nothing to do with it. Even with our fellow human rights organizations, many of them are often appreciative, but they're not quite sure it's within their mandate to do a joint letter that includes a quote from the Jewish sources or this kind of thing. But we negotiate all those things, and then there's the delegitimization. Those who say, well, because you're not all Orthodox rabbis, you're not really legitimate rabbis, and therefore we don't have to really take into account what you're saying. So all those things are happening at once, but I think we do contribute something important, not only to the religious dialogue or discussion, but also to the general as well. Yes?
I was wondering why you wouldn't ask for the end of the blockade of Gaza. If a lot of the resources provided to Palestinians have either been stripped of them by Hamas or utilized in ways that they weren't supposed to. One example is the concrete
Right.
that Israel provided to Gaza to build schools and hospitals in Gaza City that were in turn used to build air tunnels that were utilized in the summer storm.
Right. So, yes, imports are a more complicated issue than exports, one might argue. And the situation, I should also say, has improved insofar as before the Mamara incident, we were preventing chocolate and pasta and all these kinds of things from coming in. And after that incident, we started allowing most of those things in. All right? And so the thornier issue is, and by the way, international law allows us, even without a blockade, in other words, when I say no blockade, that doesn't mean that we can't search materials coming in and make sure that people aren't sending in missiles or something like this. I think you could do that without a blockade. And you correctly point out that the most complicated, thorny questions are what we call dual-use materials. Materials like concrete that can be used for peaceful purposes and also for building the tunnels or this kind of stuff. So I would simply say that when I talk about lifting the blockade, and I don't have a good answer for that. In other words, but I would say that, except for to say that we could certainly open up exports. And actually, there was a little bit of good news today because the first time in I don't know how long, Israel allowed Gazan fishermen to send some of their produce to the West Bank and everything. I hope that there will be signs of things to come. All I can say is that when I say end the blockade, it doesn't mean that we don't have the right to check and see that materials that really would have a military use would not be coming in. Of course, Israel has also been wrestling right now because Israel also understands the need to rebuild Gaza. And they are, of course, concerned with the possibility that you again let in concrete and again you're building tunnels. That's why different kinds of models of bringing the PA back in or somebody to oversee it have been talked about, and that will have to be worked out because it is a thorny issue. Back here. We'll go around down this way. Yes.
So, I was wondering what does your organization do, or if it does at all, anything to help alleviate human rights violations within the Palestinian territories by their leadership and by other Islamic governments, Arab governments, such as Palestinians that are living under these governments, such as in Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, and their rights being violated there as well.
Right.
Goes that or
Very good question. The question for people to hear it is: do we get involved if Palestinian human rights are being violated by Palestinians, either in the occupied territories or in Syria or whatever, or by other Arab leaders? We have on occasion spoken or written to the PA, for example, when the PA was going to carry out capital punishment or this kind of thing, or the kind of things that we and other human rights organizations oppose. In general, our feeling is that as Israeli rabbis, our responsibility is to deal with human rights violations being carried about by Israelis or by Jews. That's our mandate, in the same way that a lawyer who has passed the bar in California can't necessarily practice law in Indiana. And so it's beyond our mandate. We in the entire human rights community in Israel had a lot of debates about what to do with everything that was going on in Syria, which you also mentioned. Because on the one hand, we had a feeling, how can we not do anything? And on the other hand, we had a feeling that a public statement by Israeli human rights organizations would simply play into the hands of the Syrian government. As well as intended as it might be on our part, it would be used, look, all the opposition against us is just one more Zionist plot or something like this. Adalah, the Israeli Arab human rights organization, felt in a different position, and they did speak out against what was going on in Syria. And as I think you know, there have been all kinds of originally more undercover, now a little bit more public efforts by Israelis to provide humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees and this kind of stuff. We've simply, though, felt that if we would get an appeal by the Syrian resistance to do something like make some kind of statement, that we would do so, but feeling in lieu of that, that we might actually cause them more harm than we would actually help them, as well-intentioned as we might be. It was a follow-up here, and I was going to go this way, and then I can go over that way.
Okay. I'm just worried.
Time?
Well, I'm worried about your own fatigue, and everyone may leave.
All right.
So you want to take maybe one more question?
Well, I saw three questions here. Maybe I'll take them all together and try to answer them one after the other.
Okay.
People who are leaving, please take our newsletters outside, and there's also these cards that you can fill in if you want to be on our mailing list or this kind of stuff. But okay, so you wanted to follow up.
My follow-up is simply, so you say you don't want, like the hesitation was so it doesn't play into the Assad government and say, oh, it's a Zionist plot. But what about the use of your organization by organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, who are very unilaterally, their actions are very unilaterally anti-cooperation and anti-peace. And they, a lot of times, say, look, we have these rabbis from human rights saying this is this, so it must be true. What do you say about that? Since you are, you say,
All right.
Zionist.
So, first of all, something like Jewish Voices for Peace, I have my criticism of them. I also think they're being unfairly maligned by many people in the Jewish community. That would be a long thing that we don't have time to go into. We are very conscious of the fact that we can say things, and some people will say, look, even the rabbis say. When I was on trial for standing in front of bulldozers, that petition of 400 rabbis, that letter that I talked about, originally we were going to put it in the New York Times. At the time, we felt that Israel was under too much attack. It wasn't the right time. We put it in the Forward and the Haaretz. And other times we have put stuff in the New York. So it's something that's a constant debate. I would only add that there's a second side of the story. It's a real issue. We think about it. We try to be careful in how we say things. Sometimes I'm giving an interview and I say, how do I construct each sentence so no one can take half the sentence and misinterpret what I'm trying to say. But I also get all kinds of letters from people that say, I used to think the worst things about Israel, but now that I know about you, my opinion has improved. I understand that there's an Israeli democracy and people like you can fight for justice inside Israel. And now I think much better of Israel than I did before. Back in 1997, when we returned Palestinian cave dwellers to their homes and where they'd been expelled. And a friend of mine said, I saw you on Abu Dhabi television. At the time, Abu Dhabi was kind of like the Al Jazeera of its time. And I said, with all the PR budget in the world, Israel couldn't pay to get on broadcast throughout the Arab world, Israelis celebrating a human rights victory with Palestinians after justice had been won. So it goes both ways. It is an issue, but it really goes both ways. So, okay, I'll take all the other questions and try to answer. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Regarding ISIS, what's going on?
Yes.
Once in a while, you will hear ISIS referred to as ISIL.
Yeah.
Do you see any implications for Israel in that terminology?
All right, I'm not sure I understand what ISIL means.
The Islamic State in the Levant.
Okay.
What does that imply?
In other words, that they could go after Israel as well, is what you're saying. Okay, and question over here?
My question was to take a step back. The Catholic theologian Hans Küng said there will never be peace among nations until there is peace among the religions. And my question was, is there any substantial at the theological level, dialogue between Judaism and Islam in Israel?
Okay. So, and I guess the other person wanted to ask a question. Another question over here, okay.
The little hope that I have on the Palestinian side is the increase in the policy of Sabur, nonviolent
Steadfastness, yes.
steadfastness, which I think would be more an adjective than something else. Do you see any possibility of that growing and being encouraged by cooperative work with organizations such as yours?
Okay. And one more question over here? No, okay. All right. So I have no doubt that ISIS would ultimately wants to take over the Middle East if they could. Right now in Israel, they're not our greatest worry. We're more worried about Iran's nuclear capability and other kinds of things. We pretty much feel that we have the capability to prevent ISIS from invading us or this kind of stuff, but we're aware of who they are, of course. In terms of, there isn't enough Jewish-Muslim dialogue. We're actually, it looks like the Board of Rabbis for Human Rights and the Board of something called the Interfaith Coordinating Council in Israel have just decided that RHR is going to absorb the Interfaith Coordinating Council and we'll be doing a little bit more interfaith work perhaps. And the Interfaith Coordinating Council has had some high-level dialogues between rabbis and imams and this kind of stuff. And we've done some of that as well, but there could be a lot more that could be done.
You make the point that when you ignore religion or you have a kind of a tin ear, as some of our diplomats with the State because they're not
Right.
so inclined, that you miss something. And Kuhn's point was, this is really the most basic answer.
Well, so a very interesting figure just died this year, Rabbi Menachem Froman. And Rabbi Froman, himself a settler, was in constant dialogue with Hamas. He would meet with Sheikh Yassin. And when the Israeli government, without admitting they were talking to Hamas, wanted a backdoor channel to talk to Hamas, he was their man. And he always said, and this gets back to where I started, that although the common wisdom is you've got to keep religion out of it, he said, Sheikh Yassin and I could solve this all in 5 minutes. Unfortunately, he never quite explained how he was going to do that. But he did at certain, and he's got some followers today. The basic idea was that if we as religious people, starting from the idea that it doesn't belong to us, it doesn't belong to anybody, it belongs to God, then maybe we'd be a little bit more relaxed in our drive to get temporal control. We do dialogue and discussion, but and it is important, it's very important. We do more what I call, but we do more action, and what I call, for example, the dialogue of the olive groves. When we have average Israelis, and we have hundreds of volunteers a year, standing shoulder to shoulder picking olives with Palestinians, and if it's a good day and nothing is happening, you either die of boredom or you start communicating with each other. One day I'm working next to this young man, and I become a little bit surprised when I find out that his normal job is, when he's not helping his family, is he was a part at the time of Yasser Arafat's presidential guard. And if I'm a little bit blown away to be working with someone from the presidential guard, he's 10 times more blown away to be working with an Israeli rabbi. If he says to me, why are you here? This makes no sense. Explain this to me. And I talk to him about the Jewish tradition of peace, of human rights, of tikkun olam, of justice. He says, as far as Palestinians, there is no justice. And although we were still a few months away from Hanukkah, we're at the darkest time of the year, we light first 1 candle, then 2, and then 3. I said, when all is dark, you have to start by lighting that first candle. He's very excited. He goes and tells us to his whole family. No, I'm not naive. I don't know what that young man has done since. Plenty of people from the Palestinian security forces have also been involved in terror. But I know there's a much greater chance that that young man, when he comes to moral crossroads, will choose the path of nonviolence, having had that experience and having not. And many of the Palestinian activists that we work with say time and again how important it is that their own people see positive examples of nonviolent cooperation between Jews and Palestinians, achieving something. And again, remind me of your question, the last question? Right, samud, steadfastness. Well, right. So that really is a continuation of what I just said. There is a real debate going on in Palestinian society between those who believe in violence and those who believe in nonviolence. I once went to a conference of Palestinian nonviolent activists, and it wasn't just preaching the converted, it was young people really deciding which way they were going to go. Incredibly important. And again, our job has to be to empower them. What are we doing to empower that Palestinian mother that wants their child to know something different than maybe what they've been absorbing up till then? And the fact is, only I as an Israeli, particularly a religious Israeli, can break down the stereotypes that so many Palestinians have about Israelis, particularly religious Israelis, for whom all religious Israelis for Palestinians are violent, fanatic settlers, thereby empowering Palestinian peacemakers to be heard by their own people. Only they can empower me, Palestinians can empower me to be heard by my fellow Israelis. We're in it together. But maybe that's our third mandate, is breaking down those stereotypes to empower Palestinian peacemakers. I think that, again, as I just said, many of the Palestinians that we work with talk about the fact that their own people need to see that it works. And if right now we're looking like we might be on the brink of a third intifada, it's because many people have come to the conclusion maybe it won't work. maybe that's not getting us anywhere. And again, but we must, in whatever we can, break down stereotypes, give Palestinians hope that there is a future through nonviolence and through cooperation and being samud in that way. I want to conclude by saying, and then afterwards I will schmooze for a few more minutes informally with whoever who would like to do so. I'm an inveterate schmoozer till I get dragged off. To be an activist, whether it be here or there or anywhere, you have to have a certain predilection for beating your head against the wall. But every once in a while, the wall breaks. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I didn't know that in very concrete ways, there are Israelis with a better standard of healthcare today because of what we've done. We have changed for the better how the Israeli government deals with the poorest and weakest Israelis, and that there are Palestinian farmers who have returned to lands that have been taken over, or are harvesting olives in places they couldn't get to for years and years and years. That's one of the things that keeps me going. A second thing that keeps me going is I want to be able to look at my children in the eyes if one day they ask me, Daddy, what were you doing when? And to get back again to where I started, I believe in the principle, Lo alecha had mechad igmor. Our tradition teaches us that, you know, we might not do it all in our lifetime. We might not manage to fix everything. We're not expected to. But neither are we free to desist from doing our part. And if you have faith that the arc of history and God's plan for humanity and for our world is ultimately moving in the right direction, then you can understand that even if sometimes you get up and say, you know, couldn't a nice Jewish boy do something better than stand in front of bulldozers? That ultimately you're doing your part. It's part of a greater tapestry, and you may not all do it all, you may not succeed in everything, but you are doing your part. And we have a wonderful, wonderful image in our Talmud, where we're taught to look at all of life as two perfectly balanced scales on both the personal and the cosmic levels. And we never know what little act that we take that seems meaningless, pointless, irrelevant, ineffective at the time, whether that will be the act that tips those scales one way or the other. And so my closing hope and wish and prayer and blessing for all of us, whether it be the Middle East or any of the other spheres of our personal and public and spiritual lives, is to always have the courage and the wisdom and the faith to tip the scales in the right direction. Thank you. Todah, shukran.